Learn English through stories, 10 tales of heart and meaning. Moral story playlist for 1 hour. The Clockmaker's Shadow. A story inspired by the quiet urgency behind the words, "Don't waste your life." There once was a town nestled where the hills met the sea, an old, sloping place where morning fog curled around chimneys and seagulls marked the hours better than bells. The people lived quietly there, not unhappily, just routinely. Days folded into each other like pages in a worn book. In this town lived Nico, the clockmaker. His shop was small, tucked between a closed-down bakery and a flower stall that only bloomed in spring. The building was old, its wood swollen with ocean air, its windows soft with dust. But inside the shop, inside, was a world of motion. Tiny gears danced. Pendulums swayed. Delicate springs ticked softly, like polite conversations between old friends. Nico knew each clock by name, though he had never told anyone. The blue one by the window. That was Lydia, steady and kind. The tall one with the chipped mahogany case. Sebastian, proud but patient. And the tiny gold watch no bigger than a plum pit. Theo, quiet and curious. Each morning, before unlocking the door, Nico would wind the great tower clock in the village square and whisper, "Another day to notice." It was a habit he'd had for years. No one knew what he meant by it. Most walked past the tower without glancing up. Nico never married. Never left. Never did anything terribly wrong, but perhaps, he sometimes felt, not much terribly right either. His life was precise, well-ruled, and muted. But hidden beneath all that precision was something he rarely touched, a journal wrapped in cloth and tucked deep beneath the floorboards. It wasn't a journal of time or tasks. It held small regrets, moments unspoken, promises left unanswered, dreams too fragile to pursue. Nico believed there would always be time. Until the day time nudged him back. It happened on a Wednesday. A child entered his shop, barefoot, muddy, carrying an old broken watch. Her eyes were bright, her clothes stitched with threadbare care. "This stopped," she said, placing it on the counter. "It belonged to my grandfather. He said you once helped him, a long time ago. He said you fix more than just clocks." Nico blinked. The watch was familiar. Too familiar. He opened its back. Inside were 3 words, etched with care, "Don't waste it." Time slowed. Something stirred in Nico's chest. Not quite pain. Not quite grief. A kind of quiet awakening. He handed the watch back and said softly, "Come back tomorrow." But when she left, he didn't stay in the shop. He closed early and walked, not toward home, not toward the clock tower, but toward the sea. He hadn't been there in years. As he walked, memories loosened their knots. His brother's laugh on this path. A letter he never sent. A piano he never dared to play in public. The girl at the inn who once waited beneath a sycamore tree for an answer that never came. The sea greeted him like an old friend who asks nothing but your presence. Nico sat on the rocks and watched the waves. He stayed there until the sky turned violet, then pulled out the journal he hadn't opened in 10 years. But instead of listing what he hadn't done, he wrote something new. Still time to dance. Still time to say thank you. Still time to forgive. Still time to begin. The next morning, Nico opened his shop but didn't begin repairing clocks. He wrote a letter. A real one. To his brother's son, the boy he had not spoken to since the funeral. He painted again. Not well, but freely. He knocked on the innkeeper's door and apologized, 20 years late. She smiled and handed him tea. When a visitor entered the shop that week, they noticed something new, a warmth in Nico's voice, a lightness in his hands. The clocks still ticked, but their rhythm had changed. They no longer marked passing. They marked presence. Children began stopping by just to listen to the ticks and chimes. Nico started teaching them, not how to build clocks, but how to listen to them. To pay attention to what wasn't being said in a noisy world. He told them the story of the child who came with the watch. How 3 little words brought him back to life, don't waste it. Years passed. Nico grew older, softer. The tower clock still rang at every hour. But now, people looked up. When Nico's time came, he passed quietly in his sleep, beneath the same sycamore tree he once ignored. The girl, now a grandmother, found him there, along with the journal. On its final page, in small, careful writing, were the words. It was never about clocks. It was about noticing before the moment passed. If you read this, no, don't waste your life waiting. Live while the gears still turn. They placed the journal beneath the tower clock, beside a small plaque that read, "Another day to notice." And in time, those words became the new rhythm of the town. The Echo in the Well, a story of courage and cleverness. In the heart of an ancient forest, where the trees whispered secrets to the wind and the rivers hummed lullabies to the stones, there lived a community of animals who once knew peace. The forest was a world of balance, where the deer danced in the meadows, the monkeys played in the canopy, and the birds painted the sky with their songs. But that harmony shattered the day Dhuran, a mighty lion with a mane-like fire and eyes like thunderclouds, claimed the forest as his kingdom. He was not cruel for sport, but for hunger, for pride, and for power. Each day, he hunted without mercy. A peacock one morning, a fox the next. Even the wise old tortoise, who had lived through 3 monsoons, was not spared. The forest grew quiet. The laughter of the monkeys faded. The birds sang softer. Fear had taken root. One moonlit night, beneath the moon-bark tree, the animals gathered. The owl, ancient and slow, blinked through his spectacles. The elephant, gentle and grey, stood with his trunk curled in worry. The parrot, once full of gossip, had nothing to say. Even the mongoose, who feared nothing, sat with his tail wrapped tightly around his paws. "We cannot live like this," said the deer, her voice trembling. "We must find a way." After hours of murmurs and sighs, the animals made a painful decision. They would offer one animal each day to the lion, so that the rest might live. It was a cruel bargain, but it bought them time. And silence. For many days, the lion accepted this offering. He waited in his cave, and each morning, a trembling creature arrived. He ate without question. Without thanks. Then came the 21st day. And the name drawn was Chatura, a small, soft-furred rabbit with ears like silk and eyes that shimmered like twilight. Chatura was not strong. She was not fast. But she was still. And in her stillness, she saw what others missed. That morning, she did not cry. She did not run. She sat beneath a neem tree, watching the sunlight dance on the leaves. And then, she smiled. She had a plan. She walked slowly through the forest, stopping to greet the ants, to sip from the stream, to listen to the wind. She arrived at the lion's cave long after the sun had climbed high. Dhuran rode, shaking the stones. "You are late," he growled. "And small. I should eat too to make up for it." Chatura bowed low. "Forgive me, O king. I was delayed, by another lion. The cave fell silent. Another lion. Dhuran's voice was low and dangerous. Yes, said Chatura, her voice calm. He stopped me. He said he is the true king of this forest. He tried to eat me. I told him I belonged to you. He laughed. Dhuran's eyes burned. Take me to him. Chatura led him through the forest, not the straight path, but the winding one. Through bamboo groves and over mossy stones. Past the whispering reeds and the sleeping banyan roots. Until they reached an ancient stone well, hidden in a clearing where the sun barely touched the ground. He is inside, she said softly. Dhuran stepped forward. He looked into the well. And there, he saw a lion. Proud. Golden. Staring back. He roared. The lion roared back. He bared his teeth. The lion did the same. Fury blinded him. Pride drowned him. With a final roar, Dhuran leapt into the well. And the forest fell silent once more. The splash echoed like thunder. Then, peace. The birds returned first, cautiously. Then the squirrels. Then the deer. And finally, the laughter of the monkeys returned to the trees. Chatura walked home slowly, her ears brushing the wind, her heart steady. She had not fought. She had not run. She had simply thought. Reflection. In the end, it was not strength that saved the forest. Not speed. Not size. But stillness. And a mind that saw clearly. The ant and the elephant, a story of humility and strength. There was a time when the forest moved not by the power of wind, but by the weight of memory. In this forest, paths didn't lead anywhere, they unfolded through the way one walked them. And it was into this forest that Drona the elephant was born, a breathing monument of strength, shaped by thunder, crowned by silence. He was told he would never need to kneel. Never need to ask. That his size was enough. And so, for many seasons, Drona wandered proud but unanchored, admired but untouched. In the shadow of his gate, lived Anya the ant, small, tenacious, and tuned to frequencies Drona had never heard. Where he saw vines, she saw lifelines. Where he saw dust, she saw history. Her life was one of thousands around her, connected, rhythmic, quietly profound. Their paths crossed at dawn, beside an ancient banyan where roots braided time. Anya was carrying a crumb, twice her weight, when a tremor interrupted her pilgrimage. A heavy foot had landed nearby, knocking her sideways. Careful, she called, brushing dirt from her thorax. Drona peered down, amused. Oh, you speak. I do, she said. Do you listen? That was their first meeting. It ended not with conflict, but with curiosity. Seasons shifted like shawls on the forest's shoulders. Rains came, then left. The river, once a mirror of the sky, withered into silence. Animals grew lean. Fruit became rare. Even Drona's strength began to sag beneath the weight of thirst. He watched birds fly lower. Deer walk slower. But amidst the desolation, he noticed the ants, working, planning, adapting. He followed them one day and found them gathered around a puddle no larger than his ear. Tiny droplets lifted in leaves, passed from leg to leg, stored inside hollow bark. He asked Anya, "How did you know where to find water?" She answered, "We don't search. We remember." Drona began sitting more. Listening more. He asked questions he had never thought to ask. About root networks. Soil temperatures. The way bees learn stories from flowers. Anya taught patiently. She once led him on a path only visible when sunlight hit dew at the right angle. The journey took hours, but for the first time, Drona didn't want to arrive. He wanted to absorb. When fire threatened the forest from the west, Drona didn't stamp it out with brute force. Instead, he shielded paths the ants had dug for other animals. He blocked smoke from burrows. He became a guardian, not a warrior. Whispers grew about the giant who listened. Birds sang of him differently. Even the wind began to lean gently against him, as though thanking him for finally becoming part of the forest instead of towering over it. Anya grew old, not in body, but in cycles. One evening, she climbed onto Drona's tusk and said, "I may not return tomorrow." Drona said nothing. But when the stars arrived, he stood beside her colony, trunk bowed, as thousands of ants formed a spiral around their elder. When her soul slipped quietly into the soil, fireflies lit the night, not mournful, but reverent. Drona stayed until dawn. He didn't cry. He remembered. Years later, when young animals asked about the massive prints near the banyan or the stone polished smooth by an elephant's stillness, the elders would say, "That is where pride became patience. That is where thunder knelt beside silence." The monkey and the crocodile, the heart that waited. A river fable unfolding across lifetimes and lifelines. Before the first hunter whispered into the forest and before the first boat troubled the river's skin, there was stillness. A stillness so old that even the wind stepped carefully. In this silence lived a tamarind tree, its branches touching both sky and water, as if it had grown to carry conversations between worlds. And nestled in its arms lived a monkey named Vidu, whose spirit echoed not with noise, but with listening. He rose with mist and slept with moonlight. He did not gather more than he needed, nor speak when silence was enough. Other monkeys called him odd. The birds, they called him wise. One sunrise, as mist unfurled like rolled parchment, ripples formed below. Karun, the crocodile. Eyes like pebbles. Heart like moss-covered stone. His hunger that day was not for fish, but for meaning. They exchanged no names, only silence. On the second day, a glance. By the fifth, fruit passed gently from branch to water. By the seventh, stories. Vidu spoke of stars that danced alone, of clouds that never touched, of trees that mourned in monsoon. Karun listened like a river bank does, holding it all, shaping none. But below his calm floated a storm. His mate was withering, caught between breath and the place beyond it. A forest woman once said, "Only the heart of the joyful can stir the fading back." And so Karun plotted softly. On the 12th full moon, he spoke. "My mate is dying." Vidu did not blink. "She needs what you carry." Vidu lowered a tamarind into the river. "Then take me to her." They traveled across water so deep even time could not touch the bottom. But midway, Karun paused. "I lied." "I know," Vidu said. Karun flinched. "You knew." The river tells everything. Even the things you don't say ripple. Karun's voice cracked. "I wanted to believe I wouldn't, but hunger, it's louder than hope." Vidu looked at the clouds as if reading their edges. "I left my heart in the tree," he whispered. "I carry only trust when I travel." Karun turned. Vidu leapt, not with panic, but with peace, back into the branches that had raised him. He did not curse. He did not flee. He simply whispered, "You mistook joy for possession. But joy cannot be plucked. It arrives and leaves on its own feet." Karun disappeared into shame. But time, like rivers, circles back. Years passed. Vidu aged. Other monkeys rose and fell like forest chants. But Vidu remained, not just living, but listening. Every evening, he dropped a fruit into the river. Not as bait. Not as offering. But as memory. Then one dusk, after a storm had cleared the sky like a confession, ripples returned. Karun. Older. Slower. But changed. I do not come for fruit, he said. Vidu nodded. Then stay. You've finally arrived. They spoke till dawn. No apologies, just truths. Not about betrayal, but about the long arc from mistake to becoming. And so the forest learned, the monkey who leapt without fury, the crocodile who returned without hunger, and the river that carried their silence like prayer. If you pass that bend by twilight and close your eyes, you might still hear a voice brushing the leaves. To love is not to own. To forgive is not to forget. But to remember with softness, that is the heart's true shape. The Ugly Duckling, a journey of quiet becoming. Retold for those who walk the long path to discover who they truly are. Long ago, in a quiet valley where the mists slept late and the reeds whispered to the wind, a clutch of eggs lay nestled under a mother duck's belly. The world was not in a hurry then, spring crept in like a sigh, and the pond mirrored the sky so perfectly that birds often tried to fly into it. The mother duck was proud of her cozy nest, tucked safely between lily stalks and a mossy tree stump. Her eggs, speckled and smooth, were her treasure. Each day, she turned them gently, sang lullabies in the language of ripples, and dreamed of the ducklings who would one day follow her in a wobbly little line. One morning, under a sun still yawning over the hills, the eggs began to tremble. Crack! Out popped fuzzy heads, 1, 2, 3, 4. Each soft, yellow, cheeping with life. The mother cooed lovingly. But the largest egg remained still. Days passed. The others grew stronger, louder, brighter. And still, the largest egg waited. Villagers walking past the pond pointed and chuckled. Maybe it's a turkey egg, one said. Or a goose, said another. Too big to be a proper duck. But the mother duck kept turning it. Whispering to it. Waiting. Finally, with a sound like a pebble slipping into water, the shell broke open. The chick that emerged was different. He was not yellow, but grey. His neck longer. His eyes quiet. His feathers soft but shadowed. The ducklings stared. The mother blinked, then pulled him close with her wing. This one, she said simply, is mine. As the ducklings grew, so did their games, splash fights, bug chases, puddle ballet. But the grey one, the last hatched, was always a little outside the circle. He laughed when they laughed, but somehow the sound didn't echo the same way. He swam farther. Thought longer. Watched birds no one else noticed. Why are your feet so big? Why do you paddle like that? You look like mud. The others teased, sometimes with giggles, sometimes with jabs. The animals near the pond took notice. The frogs blinked slowly when he passed. The squirrels, always quick to chatter, grew strangely silent when he perched nearby. He tried to mimic the others, walking the same way, quacking with the same pitch. But still, he remained the odd patch in the quilt. One day, during a game of feather tag, he accidentally knocked over a mushroom that the elder ducks had used as a perch. Clumsy, they cried. Ugly and awkward. The words landed like stones. Not sharp, just heavy. That night, He swam to the far end of the pond where the water grew cold. He looked at his reflection. "Who am I?" he whispered. The pond gave no answer. Summer turned to autumn. The green bled into gold. The birds began to prepare for migration. One afternoon, as the sky turned crimson with evening, the grey duckling saw a flock unlike any he had known. Long-necked, white-winged, gliding across the sky like moonlight-given feathers. He stared, breathless. Their cries were haunting. Beautiful. Somehow, they tugged at something buried inside him. That night, he left. No farewell. No noise. Just a ripple in the pond, and the slow, careful paddling of one who did not know where they were going, only that they could no longer stay. Winter came like a forgotten debt, all at once and without apology. The duckling, now thin and weathered, wandered from pond to river bank to abandoned barn. Wherever he went, he was turned away. A rooster snapped at him. A dog barked cruelly. Even the wine seemed to push him back. He found shelter beneath an overturned boat. He ate frozen berries. He slept curled like punctuation, afraid to finish the sentence of his journey. Sometimes he dreamed of the white birds in the sky. Sometimes he dreamed of nothing. Then, one morning, when he was sure his wings would never lift, warmth touched his feathers. He opened his eyes to a world softened by melt. Buds peeked from branches. The ice on the pond cracked like a smile. And into that moment, graceful and real, the white birds returned. Swans. They glided across the water like poetry in motion. And the now-grown duckling, taller, sleeker, though still unsure, stepped toward the pond. He did not expect a welcome. But one of the swans looked up. "Come," she said. He backed away. "I'm not like you." The others turned. Their eyes were kind. Not surprised. Not mocking. He shuffled toward the water and looked down. The pond reflected not a duckling. Not a shadow. A swan. Pure. Elegant. Real. He had not changed in a moment. He had become. He sought that evening. Not to escape, but to return. To the pond. To his mother. To the reeds and the place where the world first called him too much. The Lion and the Mouse, a story of unlikely grace. In the heart of a vast golden savanna, where acacia trees stood like silent sentinels and the wind whispered through tall grasses, ruled a lion of formidable presence. He was called Barfu, the one who thunders. His mane was like a firestorm, and his paws shook the earth. Animals across the plains both feared and respected him, for he was not only powerful, but wise in a way that only solitude can teach. Barfu lived alone, not because he was unkind, but because strength, it seemed, was a wall. And strength, he believed, needed no companion. One humid afternoon, as the sun painted long shadows across the plain, Barfu lay beneath the shade of a tamarind tree, dozing in the drowsy heat. That's when it happened. A tiny mouse, barely the size of Barfu's claw, scurried over his back, unaware of the massive beast beneath her. In one swift, drowsy reflex, the lion awoke and slammed a paw over her. Dust rose. Silence followed. "Who dares dance on my spine?" He growled, his voice like distant thunder. "Speak, or be swallowed by the earth." The mouse, trembling, looked up. I meant no harm, O king. I sought only a path home. Please, mighty Barfu, spare me." The lion tilted his head, amused. "You are nothing but a breath in the grass. Why should I let you go?" The mouse swallowed hard. Because even the smallest creature may one day help the greatest. Barfu chuckled, not unkindly. Such arrogance in a pebble. Very well. Run home with your courage intact. And with a flourish, he lifted his paw and let her go. The mouse vanished into the brush like a thought forgotten. Days turned into weeks. Rain clouds gathered and fell. The land grew lush and green again. And Barfu, the untouchable king, continued his solitary rule. Then came the day the hunters arrived. Their traps were silent things, metal snares hidden among leaves, designed not to wound, but to hold. Barfu, curious and unaware, stepped into one. The world snapped. Cables wrapped around his legs and chest. He roared, but his cries scattered only birds. No creature dared approach. He struggled for hours. The ropes cut deeper. The weight of his own breath grew heavier. And just as dusk began to whisper its goodbyes to the sky, a rustle came from the bush. It was her. The mouse, her eyes wide but brave, approached. Without a word, she began to gnaw. Rope by rope, thread by thread. The lion watched in stunned silence. "Why would you help me?" he asked hoarsely. She paused only briefly. "Because once, you let kindness live." Hours passed. The last strand fell. Barfu, free but weak, looked down at her in a way he'd never looked at anyone before. "Your teeth did what my claws could not," he said quietly. "You have given me something I had forgotten." The power of mercy returned. From that day on, the lion no longer ruled in solitude. Beneath his throne tree, there was always a little space, hollowed in the earth, where the mouse sat in safety. They did not speak often. They did not need to. Their bond was not built from words. It was built from grace. Moral? Even the smallest being carries a gift the mighty may one day need. Kindness does not measure itself in size, but in sincerity. The Golden Eggs. A timeless fable told not in Hest but in Hosh. In the farthest corner of a valley shaped like a sleeping hand, surrounded by 7 hills veiled in mist, there existed a village that never appeared on any map. It was called Tennuru, though its name was rarely spoken aloud, only remembered in lullabies sung over moonlit cradles and whispered into the folds of ancient silk saris. In this village lived a man named Haran, whose presence was as subtle as a shadow at noon. He was not a sage, nor a storyteller, nor a priest. He was a farmer by hands, a poet by silence. His life ran by the rhythm of the land. He knew when the tamarind tree would bloom before its buds had even stirred. He could tell the mood of the sky from the taste of the morning air. And he walked barefoot, not for humility, but so he could hear the earth speak through his soles. Many seasons ago, a storm arrived, not the kind that lashes roofs or bends trees, but one that slipped in as a fog of grief. His wife, who had sucked to the jasmine and coaxed laughter from vegetables, passed quietly one night. After that, Haran stopped singing. But he didn't stop listening. One winter night, as the wind stung the thatch roofs and the owls forgot to hoot, a traveler arrived, barefoot, wrapped in saffron cloth the color of a fading flame. He bore no luggage, only a satchel of neem leaves and a peculiar goose with feathers like rainlight. "I offer you this creature," said the traveler, "not for comfort, not for wealth, but for remembering." Haran bowed low, but the man was already gone, leaving only footprints that refused to melt in the frost. From that night onward, the goose stayed. She was quiet, observant, not tame, not wild, something in between. She would rest beside Haran in the evenings as he watched stars through the gaps in his roof and spoke to Leela in the past tense. Then, without fanfare, the goose laid a golden egg. Just one. It glowed faintly. Not yellow or glittering, but like the first memory of love. Haran held it in his cupped palms like a prayer. That night, he did not sleep. He simply sat, all lamp flickering, tracing invisible patterns in the air. The next morning, another egg. And the next. And the next. Each time, he whispered, "Thank you," not to the goose, but to time itself. He placed the eggs in carved wooden boxes lined with sandalwood shavings and mulberry leaves. He never told anyone. Not because he feared envy, but because the miracle was a conversation, and conversations are not performed, only shared. Years passed. Haran grew older, but not slower. He walked every day, spoke to dragonflies, made tea with tulsi, and read aloud from poetry books to the goose. He never asked for more eggs. He never asked why him. And in return, the goose never stopped giving. But news travels not with legs, but with longing. Strangers arrived. Some in fine clothes with promises of markets and jewels. Some in dust-covered sandals with wide eyes and empty sacks. One offered to build a golden temple if Haran would give just a few. He said only, "Some things grow brighter in darkness. This is not to be sold." And then came Kavi, not a merchant, but a man shaped by deadlines and deals. His shoes were polished but carried no dust. His eyes were sharp, not kind. He pretended to be a seeker, offering talk of legacy and pensions. But inside Kavi was a hunger that had no name. He waited. He watched. And one night, when the stars were veiled and Haran had fallen asleep beside the half-written page of a letter to his wife, Kavi stole the goose. He left behind a single golden feather. Kavi took the goose across cities, through tunnels of steel, into a penthouse full of glass and echoes. He offered her seeds dipped in silver, laid her on cushions woven with thread of gold. But still, only one egg each morning. Enraged, he forced her into a cage gilded in brass, made her lay on cold coins, played her recordings of chirping to stimulate fertility. When all failed, he demanded she produce more or reveal her secret. One day, unable to bear the stillness of her gaze, he held a knife. And the silence that followed was not quiet, it was catastrophic. The goose died. Inside her, no eggs, no mechanism, no treasure. Only a tiny stone. Smooth, translucent, warm like the first tear of a child. The stone vanished in his hand. The cage grew cold. And Kavi? He left the world not in death, but in forgetting. His name was erased from ledgers, his voice from recordings. People remembered only a room full of feathers that refused to decay. Back in Thennuru, Haran felt it. He didn't cry. He sang. A song no one had heard before. The next morning, there was no egg. But the box under his bed shimmered. He opened it. The eggs were gone. In their place, jasmine blossoms, a folded letter in his wife's handwriting, and one white feather that pulsed like breath. And so, Haran planted a garden. He taught the village children how to name constellations. He built a sundial that sang when wine passed through it. He gave stories, not warnings. And sometimes, just sometimes, those walking through twilight would see a goose, feathers soft as lullabies, circling the shrine at the hill's edge. It did not land. It did not cry. It simply circled once, as if remembering. The donkey in a lion's skin. The quiet braying of pretending. In a valley bordered by wine-struck grasslands and forests that hummed forgotten ballads, there lived a donkey named Bhola. His coat was ordinary, his days predictable. He hauled firewood, turned water wheels, and bore laughter, often not kindly laughter, but the sort that stings from behind. Yet Bhola bore it all. Donkeys, after all, were expected to. They were born into burdens. He found solace in moonlit stillness when the village slept and the air, at last, made no demands. One such night, beneath the banyan's shade, Bhola heard rustling. A strange breeze carried a scent unfamiliar yet thrilling, of musk and dominance, of wildness unconstrained. From a pile of hunters' remnants emerged a lion's skin, discarded like an arrogance that had grown old. Its mane was tangled, but its power still lingered like heat from ashes. Bhola stared. A thought, not his usual kind, not wary or practical, fluttered through him like the first gust before a storm. If I were this, would they still laugh? So he did. He draped the lion's skin across his back. It hung oddly, but the golden light of morning played tricks, and from a distance, even the sharp-eyed crow mistook him for the king of the jungle. Bhola walked through the fields. Silence followed. The cows bowed low. The shepherds froze. Even the monkeys in the neem tree screamed and scattered. Bhola felt something he had never tasted before, not just respect, but reverence. For once, no one mocked his gait. No one called him slow. No one saw the donkey. And yet, inside the skin, Bhola remained unsure. Each step felt larger than him. Each silence heavier. He missed the rhythm of familiar hooves on soil. He missed the songs of the field hands, even the mocking ones. But the pull of illusion is sweet. He kept wearing the skin. Until, one day, a group of children wandered too close. They didn't run, they watched, wide-eyed, expectant. Bhola wanted to roar, to stamp, to assert his pretend majesty. Instead, habit, heartache, or just a momentary slip, he brayed. Loud. Honest. Echoing through the trees like a truth long caged. The children gasped. One giggled. Another shouted, "That lion sings like Bhola Anna." And the illusion unraveled. The lion's skin slipped. In moments, word spread. It was Bhola all along. The villagers laughed harder than ever, not cruelly, this time, but with relief. The mighty predator was no threat. Just a familiar friend playing dress-up. Bhola stood still as they pulled off the hide, patted his head, and led him back to the old stone trough. His pride stung, yes. But as he drank from the cool water, he caught sight of himself reflected, not a lion, not even a clever trickster, but himself. And somehow, that began to feel enough. Moral, pretending can bring short-lived power. But authenticity, even when humble, carries peace that pretense never can. The Crow and the Pitcher, 8,000 pebbles of patience. There was once a crow named Kaga, who had known both the exhilaration of cloud-skimming winds and the heavy silence of parched summers. He was no ordinary crow, not because of a shimmering feather or an unusual call, but because of how he watched. Most birds flew in search of food or shelter, but Kaga often flew just to observe. He watched harvests fail and begin again. He watched children grow from barefooted curiosity to dusty-browed responsibility. He watched rivers dry and sing again when the sky remembered kindness. But now, the sky had forgotten. A drought had stolen color from the land. The leaves had turned brittle, the soil cracked like old skin. The very wind carried the weight of thirst. Kaga flew tirelessly. Day after day, his wings burned from the sun, his throat dry from silence. Wells were empty, ponds crumbled into memory, and even the dew on dawn grass had abandoned the earth. He was ready to fall. Then, Beneath a dying bougainvillea bush, half hidden by the cracked roots of a banyan tree, he spotted it, a pitcher. Clay. Time-worn. Still intact. He landed cautiously. Inside was water. Real. Clear. Flickering like the last candle in a temple long closed. But his beak could not reach it. For a long while, Kaga stood beside the pitcher. In his weariness, a cruel temptation surged, to scream, to break the pitcher, to claw at fate with rage. But instead, he sat. He breathed. And he listened. There was a soft sound nearby. The earth, though scarred, still cradled pebbles, small, rounded stones pressed by time, shaped by silence. One by one, Kaga picked them up in his beak and dropped them into the pitcher. Each plunk was a prayer. A prayer for patience. For resilience. For wisdom over impulse. He dropped the first 10 with trembling wings. The next 20 with hope swelling faintly. And the final pebbles with the rhythm of certainty, as if even the air began to believe again. At last, the water rose to meet him. He drank, not in desperation, but with reverence. Not to fill his belly, but to honor what it meant. From that day forward, Kaga no longer flew vast distances for survival. Instead, he flew to observe others who had given up, the calf that stood near an empty trough, the elder squirrel watching a hollow nut, the spider rebuilding its web for the 6th time. And to each, Kaga whispered, not in language, but in presence. Wait. Observe. Try again. 8,000 drops make an ocean. 8,000 failures carve resilience. He began leaving pebbles beside dried wells, pitchers, even bird baths forgotten in courtyards. Sometimes the villagers found them and laughed, which foolish bird did this? But some children saw him. And slowly, they began to leave pebbles too. Not just in pitchers, but on doorsteps, beside sleeping stray dogs, near wilted plants. A quiet ritual began, a culture of small kindness. Kaga had become not just a crow, but a teacher of time. Moral? The world doesn't change in grand gestures. It transforms in small, patient actions, one pebble at a time. True intelligence is not in knowing everything. It's in knowing what to do next, even when no one applauds. The honest woodcutter the still river remembers. In a hamlet nestled at the edge of a velvet green forest and the beginning of a long-forgotten river, there lived a man named Ayan. Neither young nor old, neither praised nor mocked, he existed like a tree that had quietly chosen to give shade without asking to be seen. Each morning, Ayan walked into the woods with an axe wrapped in an old cotton cloth, the handle worn smooth by his grandfather's hands, the blade dulled from seasons of honest labor. He cut only dead trees. He whispered to ants before stepping over logs. And when he rested, he did so beneath the trees he had spared. He worked not for ambition but for rhythm, for the joy of motion and the dignity of need met honestly. One morning, as dew still clung to cobwebs strung between neem branches and birds traded secrets with the breeze, Ayan leaned over a quiet stream to wash his face. His axe, resting loosely on a boulder, slipped from his grasp. There was no splash. Only a soft plonk, followed by widening ripples. The axe was gone. He sat in stillness for a long time. Not in rage. Not even grief. Just stillness, the kind of waiting that trees understand. As the shadows shifted and the sun stretched across the stream, something shimmered beneath the water. Rising slowly, like breath from deep sleep, came a luminous figure clothed in light and mist, a guardian of the forest waters. Her eyes held the hush of untouched places. I saw, she said simply. And I ask you this, was it this? In her hand, a golden axe, aglow with perfection. Ayan stood, looked, then lowered his gaze. No, that is not mine. That tool sings a song I do not know. She nodded once, silently. Then again, the water stirred. This time, a silver axe, polished like moonlight. Again, Ayan smiled gently. No. That too is beautiful. But my hands are calloused by iron, not silver. She offered no words. Finally, she emerged holding his old axe, scarred, chipped, and familiar. Ayan exhaled. Yes, this one bears my years, and I know its weight in the dark. The river spirit returned his axe, and with it, though he did not ask, she offered the gold and the silver. He accepted only his own. Gifts unearned unsettle the soul, he said. The spirit bowed, not in formality, but in respect, and vanished. Word trickled through the village like sweet sap in spring. Another man, Govind, restless and clever with his hands but not his heart, heard the tale. He, too, went to the forest. He, too, flung his axe into the river with performative sorrow and crafted grief. Sure enough, the guardian rose again. She held the golden axe first. Yes. Govind cried too quickly. That one is mine. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something only the water could hear. Then she faded, without a word, without an echo, and took with her all three axes. Govind went home, not lighter but less. Ayan continued his life unchanged. But the forest had changed. Birds lingered longer in the branches when he passed. Leaves rustled with familiarity. Children began walking with him into the woods, asking, "Tell us about the river that listens." And Ayan would pause near that very stream, lean on his old axe, and say, "If you shout a lie into the world, it may echo back gold. But the still places, the true places, return only what your silence deserves." Over time, no statue was built for Ayan. But a small tree grew beside the stream. And beneath it, someone carved in the bark, "Truth does not shout. It ripples." Thanks for watching. Please like, share and subscribe. ALP Academy, learn lightly, grow deeply.